in this news roundup for the week of Friday, the 17th of November, 2023. President Joe Biden and China's Xi Jinping meet in person for a key summit. What's the potential big shift we're seeing happening in front of our very eyes? TikTok has reportedly been spreading the gospel of Osama bin Laden, and the youth of America can't get enough of it. Greta Thunberg's opinions on Israel and Palestine provoke a climate protester to try to wrestle the microphone from her at a rally. And a new study reveals the truth about sudden deaths amongst young American athletes, about which there have been strong opinions. Perhaps the most globally significant news of the week was the long-awaited meeting between President Joe Biden and China's Xi Jinping. The event came at a point where tensions had been rising between the countries for quite some time, at the same time as normal channels of communication had largely been dropped or actively blocked, particularly in the aftermath of a visit by then Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan in 2021. Now, the message and the mood music has clearly changed. And the question is this: China's ambition and view of its place in the world is largely dependent on one man, the man who has been reaffirmed as leader for life, basically. Just a couple of years ago, China was brimming with confidence about imminently wresting the top slot of economic superpower off a diminishing United States. It was confident, aggressive, and uncompromising. Now its economy has taken multiple hits. It's struggling with demographic issues with an aging population, and recent conflicts such as the Ukraine war has seen a resurgent strength of purpose amongst the countries of the West, however fractious that alliance may sometimes be. A couple of years ago as well, China was actively pursuing the goal of creating a new parallel financial and political system, one to eventually replace the US dollar as the preeminent global currency and to have established its own network of like-minded allies. Now, well, it may have had time to sink in that such a project is likely measured in decades, not years, if it's even achievable. A couple of years ago, Xi Jinping was clearly straining at the bit, impatient to fulfill destiny by bringing Taiwan back into the Chinese state. Now, well, having watched carefully the unfolding consequences from Ukraine, and indeed latterly in Gaza, the massive costs of such exercises are more visible than they have been for many decades. So how much did the meeting reflect that maybe a major change in that perspective has taken place? You can certainly make the case from what we saw. Now, it was never expected there would be major breakthroughs of substance on the issues that divide the two countries. What was hoped for was a starting point, re-establishing the base level of communications that even existed between the US and the Soviet Union during the height of the Cold War, specifically communications between the military operations, with China rapidly arming and with the US deploying missiles in China's backyard, for example, hosted by Japan. It has become a major risk factor that there was no communication, so misunderstandings or unexpected events could potentially become the trigger for a major incident or even an armed conflict. Well, at this meeting, it was agreed that such communications should be re-established. It was noteworthy how even the public mood music from the two leaders differed to each other. Biden frankly faced up to the fact that the countries are in competition, but made the case that competition didn't mean there couldn't be cooperation on common areas of interest, nor indeed that competition had to mean conflict. Xi Jinping took a totally different position. He didn't agree that they were in competition at all, said that the world was big enough for two superpowers, and the strength of one could be an opportunity for the other, not necessarily a problem. This, of course, is true. If two superpower interests are broadly aligned, the US wouldn't, in principle, see, for example, a strong European Union as the same sort of problem as it does China. I mean, not that it matters, since no one's expecting the bureaucrat-led EU to emerge to that degree on the world stage in spite of its fond wishes, but it's hard to see anyone concluding overnight that such a happy state of coexistence has magically appeared between the United States and China. And so, right now, they are engaged on a variety of policy measures specifically designed to interfere with each other's success. For example, US export controls on advanced technology, trying to prevent itself from being overtaken in areas that it believes really matters. Those policies are quite effective. They really hurt China. So it's hard to pretend anything other than the reality that Biden acknowledged. These are two powers in competition. Now, one other area where there was some degree of agreement was on the issue of climate change. People in the West, at least those who see the world in black and white, as increasing numbers seem to do, get very confused about China and climate change. You either get the climate campaigners on the one hand, who, when challenged over the huge difference between China's emissions and, for instance, the UK's or the US's, point to the fact that China is investing heavily in renewables and, if they can bear to acknowledge it, nuclear power, which they are. But if this contribution to emissions was owned by the UK or the US, would they be making excuses for them then? I think we know that they wouldn't. On the other side, you get people pointing to all that new coal capacity that China has been creating and saying China doesn't care about this agenda at all, they're doing whatever they want, and laughing at us while they do it. And they have indeed, of course, been investing in coal, but saying that they're not signed up to the agenda is, at best, willful blindness. Because indeed, they are signed up to net zero by 2060, and they've said that their growth in carbon emissions will peak by 2030. Well, now, interestingly, just the week before this summit, there was a substantial piece of analysis by the website Carbon Brief that suggested that given the actual capacity the country's been building, that peak in emissions might be coming significantly sooner. Indeed, this, 2023, could be the peak year, with emissions to start falling from next year. Well, that would be quite significant. So here's the deal. China, unlike many of the eco-campaigners, has been seeking to guarantee energy security for its rapidly growing nation, having experienced major shortages in recent years, whilst also making climate commitments that it's clear that Xi Jinping expects to keep. He specifically seeks to distinguish China from the US on this, saying that America promises big, but then doesn't deliver. Well, China will only promise what it can deliver, and it does so on its own timetable, not pressured by others. But it will do what it says it will do, and that's the difference between them, he says. When they promised that emissions would peak by 2030, what they immediately created was a set of incentives to invest in as much energy capacity before that point was reached. Because there was no ceiling set, just that it wouldn't grow after 2030. It would start to decline. So if you can get as much in as you possibly can before that point, then you achieve your energy security, and it's easier to start the decline without cost and consequence. In the last year, there has been a major rebound in energy use since the end of the zero-COVID policies that constrained economic activity. A boom in manufacturing has offset the contraction in demand for real estate, which has happened because of all the debt problems there. But that decline in real estate has brought a decline in the use of highly energy-intensive steel and cement. And quite a bit of that manufacturing that there's been a boom of has been targeted on what it sees of the technologies of the future, namely solar, electric vehicles, and battery technology. 2023 has seen record installations of low or zero carbon energy generating capacity, and it's starting to get to the scale now where it's becoming a real factor. China's solar energy output is set to exceed 600 gigawatts this year, up from 375 gigawatts last year. That's a higher amount of new installed capacity this year than was added to the entire world the previous year. Indeed, in 2023, the growth of clean energy capacity will exceed the average growth of demand for energy for the first time. So, in spite of the new wave of coal plant construction, Carbon Brief analysts said that they believed emissions could enter a period of structural decline from next year. There will be, no doubt, numerous devils lurking in numerous details, but the situation makes it relatively easy, certainly easier, for Xi Jinping to make grand gestures of cooperating with the US on climate objectives. Now, China's not going to agree to limit its ability to bring on that already planned coal expansion, but if it can peak its overall emissions so that globally we start to see this path towards the beginning of a reduction, that will be an extremely potent symbol. Critics of Western climate policy, those that are capable of talking in shades of grey anyway, may well point out that achieving energy security was the first step to getting to that point, and pursuing climate goals in the absence of energy security is a very different proposition. Coming back to Xi Jinping and President Biden, how much should we take it therefore that Xi has adapted his worldview and his ambition for the role that China's going to play? Rather than expecting to be the new world number one, taking over America's top slot while it declines, is he now seeing that the two should instead be a mutually reinforcing duopoly? You might wonder when you reflect on the other event that he took part in during this one, which was an exclusive dinner with some of the top American business chief executives. Larry Fink of BlackRock, Steve Schwarzman of Blackstone reportedly sat at Xi Jinping's own table. Also present at the dinner were Tim Cook of Apple, Albert Bourla of Pfizer, Ray Dalio of Bridgewater. Xi's message to them all was that China is a market that's open to foreign business. It's not how it appeared in recent years, for sure. One reason why many Western businesses, in the name of de-risking, have been retreating from China, or at least leaving themselves less exposed. But the fact that foreign direct investment has hit a 25-year low is one key reason why the Chinese economy is actually struggling now. So the fact that Xi took the time to engage in a charm offensive with American business, it's a pretty clear indicator that the old vision that maybe China should plan for a big decoupling of the world economy, that it should build itself an alternative economic ecosystem so it could thrive outside of a relationship with the old system. Let's just say that may have moved from being plan A to plan B, or even from plan B to plan C, at least for the time being. Probably shouldn't count on it, not least because, again, it all depends on one man who's been purging his immediate circle with the sort of people who might give him advice that he doesn't want to hear, which is never a good sign in terms of good governance. But it does seem from this summit that at least he's situationally aware of China's position and that is leading him to be flexible in the short term. Let's not put it too strongly, but it's significant what we've just seen, and it's well worth watching. Oh, and there might be pandas involved.
Hooray!
Which is a plus for sure. I mean, most people like pandas. And of course, how it plays out if the US presidential election in 2024 delivers a new executive branch that is more directly confrontational to China, That is another big question mark as well. After all, Trump is probably the kind of guy who would punch that panda given half a chance. All right, some other news items, including ones that might have passed you by this week. People have been getting very exercised, it seems, by the phenomenon of not only strongly pro-Palestinian and anti-Israel sentiment on TikTok amongst young people, but even this week a viral wave of youngsters concluding that Osama bin Laden, you know, the old guy famous for slopping soup down his beard and murdering 2,000 American civilians, well, he kind of had a point. This brave new variation on the theme of people say stupid stuff on the internet came after bin Laden's rather old letter to America suddenly became a major focus. The letter sought to justify the 9/11 attacks. Spoiler, it was apparently all America's fault, as well as plugging into the current heat, saying that the oppression of the Palestinian territories must be revenged and so on, which is probably why it's taken flight again right now. TikTok denied that this had trended on its platform, saying that far more people were searching for skincare and for movies. And to prove that it definitely wasn't trending, it manually removed references to hashtag Letter to America, as you sometimes have to do when something definitely is not trending. What does all of this signify? Well, some are arguing that it's the product of what happens when you teach a young generation of children to hate their own country, or at least to be ashamed of it. You have then primed them to agree with your country's critics, even the mass murdering ones, apparently. Others, however, blamed the company TikTok. So, for example, the actor Sacha Baron Cohen said that it had created, quote, the biggest anti-Semitic movement since the Nazis. And it did this, he argued, by feeding images to young people that encouraged hate. Others are arguing that it's just people saying stupid stuff on the internet. Maddening though it may be, it's something that's been happening almost as long as the internet has been in existence. And you would expect it to trend towards peak stupidity, they say, when there are indeed difficult and divisive issues in the world. It is possible that not all of those explanations are mutually exclusive, of course. Now, not everyone's happy about the political opinions of young people, and this became evident this week when an older climate campaigner tried to physically wrest a microphone away from Greta Thunberg at a 70,000-strong rally on climate change in Amsterdam. Thunberg was reportedly leading the crowd in pro-Palestine chants when the man climbed onto the stage, grabbed the microphone and said that he'd come there for a climate demonstration, not for political views. Greta presumably keeps in shape, or else he doesn't, because this adult male failed to wrestle the microphone away from the 20-year-old Thunberg before being dragged away by security. At which point, apparently completely unbothered by it, she then carried on chanting, "No climate justice on occupied land." Just as an indicator of how conflicted all of these groups currently are, a separate speaker tried to go further, chanting the highly provocative "from the river to the sea" phrase, taken by many as calling for the destruction of the state of Israel. That speaker had her speech cut short, this time by the rally organisers themselves. All references to Greta Thunberg are apparently being removed from Israeli textbooks and the school curriculum there, after she expressed her support for Gaza recently. Now, there is no suggestion that she's expressed support for Hamas, and she's even said that the Hamas attack on Israel had been horrific. Nevertheless, the Israeli Education Ministry itself said that her statements on Gaza had disqualified her from being an educational role model. Now, look, I've said complimentary things about Greta here, and I've said critical things of Greta here, depending on the context. But I'm not sure why she was ever an educational role model, given that she's an activist and a campaigner. I mean, that's nothing against activists and campaigners. It's nothing against her specifically. Just because you approve of someone doesn't automatically make them an educational role model. But anyway, she isn't anymore in Israel, we hear. By the way, speaking as we were about people saying stuff on the internet, a new scientific study came out this week looking at the phenomenon of sudden cardiac deaths in the US college athletes in the last 20 years. Now, some of you may recall that I did a video on this topic a while ago in response to a request then by a viewer to look into claims that such deaths were surging, and they were influenced by various people attributing such a surge to harm from the COVID vaccines. Now, I wasn't really able to comment on that because when I looked at the evidence provided for the claim, it was a website that included vast numbers of deaths and other incidents that demonstrably had nothing to do with young athletes, nor of symptoms that could have been vaccine caused, such as, I remember one particularly, a young person unnamed who died in a road accident on their motorbike, probably not caused by the vaccine. In other words, if there was a case to be made, it was not being done justice by a laughable website that apparently relied on you not bothering to read the details of the cases that it had cobbled together. I also, for that video, came across the various academic papers pre-pandemic that were already talking about the phenomenon of sudden death amongst young athletes. It has been a thing for quite some time. So making the case that there'd been a recent surge, which is not out of the question, but it requires more than just pointing at one or two recent cases and raising a knowing eyebrow. You have to be able to show that it's actually happening more. Well, this new study has actually looked carefully at all the documented cases and has shown that rather than a recent surge, instances in sudden death in young athletes has actually been slowly, gradually declining over recent years. It looked at all causes of deaths and found that half of them came from different forms of accidents, 13% from cardiac incidents, heart attacks, nearly 12% from suicides, 9% from homicides, and so on. Only 8 athletes suffered from fatal instances of myocarditis, a condition associated with COVID-19 infection and vaccination. Only one of those, however, occurred after COVID-19 arrived on the scene, so the others were all pre-vaccines, pre-COVID. And the one that came after was apparently giant cell myocarditis, which is not the form associated with vaccine harm anyway. So, as ever, the process of pointing randomly at stuff and implying that there must be a connection, still not as reliable as actually looking at data and boring stuff like that. None of this should be a surprise. Things that have a real case behind them usually come up with some solid evidence, which this one demonstrably did not. It's not any refutation, by the way, of the well-evidenced link between COVID-19 and the vaccines and cases of myocarditis, as well as other conditions such as blood clotting, in a small but a very real number of people that have some real personal tragedies behind them. In the UK, there'll be a test case with a couple of affected parties suing AstraZeneca, for example. Just not specifically as a factor affecting the youngest and fittest athletic community, as many were claiming. All right, my thanks as always to the people who support this channel on Patreon, as well as those who give occasional donations via PayPal. Link for that in the description below. If you want to add your name to the community of supporters, please head on over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. This channel could not survive without that support. Either way, have a great week. See you next time.